If there is a pilot on this plane, any pilot, you need to come forward now. Ethan Walker did not move. His hand stayed folded on his knee, his leather jacket creaking as he leaned back. Around him, 200 strangers looked everywhere except at the man they had spent 4 hours avoiding. The woman beside him clutched her purse against her chest. A businessman across the aisle stared at the patch on his shoulder. And Ethan, the biker, the outlaw, the man everyone had already judged, closed his eyes and whispered one word that no one heard: no. Before we go further, if this story reaches you, do me a favor. Subscribe to the channel, stay with me all the way to the end, and leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Ethan's story travels tonight. The trouble started before the plane ever left the gate. Ethan Walker, who was the last person to board Flight 1487 from Denver to Anchorage, and he felt every eye in the cabin land on him the moment he stepped through the door. He was used to it. 39 years old, 6'2", blonde hair pushed back under a bandana, a jaw that hadn't been shaved in 3 days, and a black leather jacket that had seen more miles than most of these people had driven in their lives. The winged skull patch on his back read one word in curved letters: Hell's Angels. He didn't blame them for staring. He'd made peace with the staring a long time ago. What he hadn't made peace with, what he could never make peace with, was the way a room went quiet when he entered it. "Excuse me," he said, ducking under the overhead bins, working his way down the narrow aisle. A man pulled his elbows in sharply. A mother slid her toddler closer to the window. Somewhere near the back, a teenager lifted his phone, and Ethan heard the tiny electronic click of a photo being taken. He didn't turn around. He'd learned that too. Seat 5A window. He shoved his small duffel bag into the bin, sat down, and let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding since the security line. The woman in 5B had been reading a magazine. When Ethan lowered himself into the seat beside her, she went very still. The kind of still a rabbit goes when a hawk crosses the sky. Then slowly, deliberately, she reached down and pulled her purse off the floor and set it in her lap, both arms wrapped around it. Ethan saw it. Of course he saw it. He always saw it. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "your bag's safer on the floor. Gets in the way of the seatbelt up there." She didn't answer. She turned 2 inches toward the aisle, angling her whole body away from him, and lifted the magazine higher like a wall. Ethan nodded to himself. All right, he thought. That's how it's going to be. He turned to the window. Outside, the ground crew was loading the last of the bags, their breath fogging in the cold Denver morning. A de-icing truck rolled by. Ordinary things. Small things. Ethan focused on them because focusing on small things was how he stayed calm, and staying calm had once been the only thing standing between him and death. But that was another life. That was a man named Captain Walker, and Captain Walker didn't exist anymore. Ethan had killed him 5 years ago, buried him, and walked away from the grave without looking back. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a photograph. It was creased at the corners, soft from being handled 1,000 times. A little girl, maybe 8 years old, gap-toothed and grinning, holding up a drawing of a stick figure on a motorcycle. Under the drawing, in wobbly crayon letters, "My dad." Her name was Lily. She was 13 now, and she was waiting for him in Anchorage, and Ethan had promised her the way you only promise a child once, and then spend the rest of your life keeping it, that he would never do anything dangerous again. He tucked the photo back into his jacket over his heart and closed his eyes. He did not know yet that in 90 minutes that promise was going to be tested in a way he could never have imagined. The man in the seat 4C had been watching Ethan since he boarded. He was old, mid-80s, maybe older, with a spine that had refused to bend even as the rest of him folded inward with age. He wore a wool cardigan and a small enamel pin on the collar, a pin that most people wouldn't recognize, but that meant everything to the handful who would. His eyes were pale blue and terribly sharp, and they had been fixed on the biker in 5A for a very long time. Not the way the others watched him. Not with fear. With recognition. "Interesting," the old man murmured to himself and turned back to the window. His name was Walter Hayes. 60 years ago, he had flown B-52s over places the history books still argued about. And though his hands trembled now and his hearing had mostly gone, one thing had never left him: the ability to spot another pilot in a crowd. It wasn't the jacket, it wasn't the tattoos, it was something in the way the younger man had moved down the aisle, the way his eyes had swept the exit rows, counted. The doors clocked the flight attendants all in the space of 3 seconds without slowing his stride. Civilians don't do that, Walter thought. That boy's flown something, and not for fun. He filed the observation away and said nothing. Old soldiers learned to keep their observations to themselves. But he kept one eye on seat 5A all the same. Jam. The flight attendant working the forward cabin was named Grace Okafor, and she had been flying for 11 years, which meant she had learned to read a plane the way a captain reads the sea. She could feel the mood of a cabin, could tell when a flight was going to be easy or when it was going to be a long, tense 5 hours of somebody's bad day radiating outward. Flight 1487 felt tense, and Grace knew exactly why. It was the man in 5A. She'd watched the whole cabin recoil from him, and it made something tighten in her chest because Grace had learned over 11 years and roughly 4,000 flights that the passengers everyone was afraid of were almost never the ones who caused trouble. The trouble came from the polished ones, the men in suits who thought the rules didn't apply to them, the quiet ones who'd had 6 drinks in the terminal, the bikers, the tattooed men, the rough-looking ones, 9 times out of 10. They were the ones who helped you lift a bag into the overhead for a stranger who said, "Thank you, ma'am," who fell asleep in 10 minutes and gave you no trouble at all. Grace made her way down the aisle doing her pre-flight checks, and when she reached row 5, she stopped and looked directly at Ethan and smiled a real smile, not the professional one. "Can I get you anything before we push back, sir? Coffee, water?" Ethan looked up, and for a half second something flickered across his face, surprise. Not that she'd offered, that she'd looked at him, that she'd said sir like she meant it. "Coffee'd be great," he said. "Black, thank you." "You got it." She moved on. But Ethan watched her go, and for the first time since he'd boarded, some of the tightness went out of his shoulders. The woman in 5B noticed the exchange. She noticed the flight attendant had smiled at the biker, and something in her face said she didn't understand it and didn't approve. Ethan noticed her noticing. He almost said something. Almost. Then he thought of Lily and the promise and how the fastest way to prove every one of these people right about him was to open his mouth, so he didn't. He turned back to the window and watched the de-icing truck spray the wing, and he waited for the plane to take him home. They were 40 minutes into the flight somewhere over the vast white nothing of the Yukon when the first strange thing happened. The seatbelt sign, which had gone off after climb-out, chimed back on. That by itself was nothing turbulence, whether a routine precaution. Grace's voice came over the intercom, calm and practiced, asking everyone to return to their seats and fasten their belts. But Ethan felt something else, something the other passengers didn't feel because they hadn't spent 10,000 hours in aircraft learning to feel it. The plane's nose came up, just slightly, just a degree or two, and it stayed up. Ethan opened his eyes. He didn't move his head. He didn't sit up. He just listened to the engines, to the airframe, to the tiny changes in pitch and pressure that most people would never consciously register. And what he heard was an aircraft that was doing something a well-flown aircraft shouldn't be doing. The nose was high. The airspeed felt wrong. There was a hesitation in the way the plane responded to the air, a sluggishness like a car with something dragging under the chassis. Probably nothing, he told himself. You're not that man anymore. Let it go. He tried to let it go. Then 4 rows back, a passenger's window shade was up, and through it, if Ethan had turned to look, he would have seen the right engine trailing a thin, wavering line of gray. He didn't turn to look, but he heard the change in the engine's pitch, a subtle drop, a flutter, and every cell in his body that had once been Captain Ethan Walker came instantly, silently awake. Across the aisle, old Walter Hayes had felt it too. The old pilot's head lifted. His pale eyes found Ethan's face, and what he saw there confirmed everything. The biker wasn't relaxed anymore. The biker was listening. Up in the cockpit, First Officer Daniel Brooks was trying very hard not to panic. He was 31 years old. He had 4 years with the airline and just under 3,000 flight hours, which was enough to be good and not nearly enough to be calm, when the master caution panel lit up like a Christmas tree and the captain sitting next to him said a word Daniel had never once heard him say in flight. "That's not right," Captain Ray Mercer said, staring at the engine instruments. Mercer was 58, 30 years in the left seat, the kind of captain who'd landed in every kind of weather God ever invented and never once raised his voice. "Number 2's losing oil pressure. Fast." "Confirmed, eh?" Daniel said, his own voice tight. "Oil pressure dropping, temps climbing. Run the checklist." Daniel's hands found the quick reference handbook. He was reaching for the tab marked engine when Mercer suddenly went quiet in a way that made Daniel look up. The captain's face had changed. His mouth was open, but no words were coming out. His left hand had come up off the yoke and pressed flat against his own chest. "Ray," Daniel said. "Ray, you okay?" Mercer didn't answer. His eyes had gone wide, then unfocused. A thin sheen of sweat had broken across his forehead in the space of 2 seconds. "Ray," and then Captain Ray Mercer, 30 years and 18,000 flight hours, and never once a raised voice made a small, choked sound and slumped sideways against the cockpit door unconscious. For 1 full second, Daniel Brooks sat frozen, staring at his captain's slack face, while beside him, a failing engine climbed toward the temperature at which it would begin, quite literally, to come apart. Then his training kicked in, and he did 3 things very fast. He keyed the intercom to the cabin, he hit the call for Grace, and he grabbed the yoke with both hands as the aircraft, no longer trimmed by the man who'd been flying it, began slowly to descend. In the cabin, Grace Okafor's phone rang at the forward galley, and the second she heard Daniel's voice, she knew. 11 years, 4,000 flights. She had never once heard a pilot sound like that. "Grace, I need you up here now," Daniel said, "and I need you to find out if there's a doctor on board." And his voice cracked just slightly, just enough, and anybody with flight experience, anybody. Military, private, anything, right now. Grace's hand tightened on the phone. Her stomach dropped in a way that had nothing to do with the descending aircraft. "Understood," she said, and her voice did not shake because 11 years had taught her that her voice was the last thing on this airplane that was allowed to shake. "On my way." She hung up. She took 1 breath. Then she reached for the cabin intercom, and every passenger on Flight 1487 heard the chime and then heard the voice of a flight attendant working very hard to sound like nothing at all was wrong. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a medical situation in the flight deck. If there is a doctor or medical professional on board, please press your call button immediately." She paused, and here her voice caught just for a heartbeat before she pushed on. "Additionally, if there is anyone on board with piloting experience of any kind, military, commercial, or private, the flight crew is requesting your assistance. Please identify yourself to the nearest flight attendant. Thank you." The cabin, which had been murmuring nervously, went absolutely silent. Grace hung up the intercom and started down the aisle, scanning faces. And as she walked, she watched the same thing happen that Ethan had watched happen his whole adult life. People looked around, searching, waiting for someone qualified to stand. 200 people, and not one of them moved. Ethan Walker sat perfectly still in seat 5A and stared at the seat back in front of him and thought, "No, not me, not this. I made a promise." The words of the announcement were still hanging in the recycled air. Anyone with piloting experience, military, commercial, private. He had all 3. He had more of the first than almost anyone on this plane could imagine. He had landed aircraft with holes in them. He had landed aircraft on fire. He had once brought a shot-up 2-seat trainer down onto a strip of dirt with an instructor bleeding out in the back and no hydraulics left, and he had walked away from it, and that walk had cost him 3 days of not being able to sleep afterward. And then he had a daughter, and a wife who left, and a daughter who was all he had. And on the worst night of his life in a hospital hallway, he had knelt down in front of an 8-year-old girl and taken both her hands in his and said, "Baby, I'm done. No more danger. No more not coming home. I promise you, I promise." He had kept that promise for 5 years. "I can't stand up," he thought. "If I stand up, I break it. If I stand up, I might not come home. And she's 13, and she has no one else." And I swore beside him, the woman in 5B pressed her call button. Not because she was a pilot, because she was frightened. Because the plane felt wrong now, and everyone knew it, and the silence in the cabin had turned from awkward to something much worse. Ethan felt the aircraft's nose come up again. Daniel up front, fighting to hold altitude with one engine dying and a body slumped against the door, and Ethan's hands resting on his knees curled slowly into fists. "Not me. Please, not me." Whoa. But Walter Hayes had been watching. The old pilot unbuckled his seatbelt, a thing they had been told not to do, and with enormous effort gripping the seatbacks, he turned himself around in seat 4C so that he was facing the man in 5A. "Son," he said. Ethan didn't look at him. "Son, look at me." Slowly, unwillingly, Ethan turned his head. The old man's pale eyes held his. And when Walter Hayes spoke, his voice was thin and cracked with age. but there was steel underneath it, the steel of a man who had once given orders and been obeyed. I watched you board this airplane, Walter said. You counted the exits before you sat down. You clocked every door. You looked at the flight attendants and figured out which one was in charge in about a second and a half. He leaned closer and his old hands, spotted and trembling, gripped the top of Ethan's seat. I flew for 31 years, son. I know what I'm looking at, and I'm looking at a pilot. Ethan's jaw tightened. You're mistaken. No, Walter said, I'm not, and neither are you. He nodded toward the front of the plane. You heard that engine change 10 minutes before that girl made her announcement. I watched you hear it. Everybody else is scared. You're not scared, son. You're calculating. And there's a difference, and only one kind of man knows what that difference feels like. Ethan said nothing. His whole body had gone rigid. Walter's voice dropped gentler now, almost kind. People don't lose years of training just because they stop wearing the uniform, he said. You can put on a leather jacket. You can grow the beard. You can ride your motorcycle and tell yourself you're somebody new. But when that door opens and the plane starts to fall, son, the man you were is the man who's going to be sitting in that seat. That's just the truth of it. The plane dropped suddenly, a stomach-lifting jolt, and a woman 2 rows back cried out and a child began to wail. And somewhere near the wing, a bag came loose and thumped to the floor. Ethan closed his eyes. Behind his eyelids, he saw Lily's face, gap-toothed, 8 years old. My dad in crayon. And then he saw her at 13 waiting at the arrivals gate in Anchorage, waiting for a plane that if he sat here and did nothing, might never land. And he understood in that moment the thing that had been hiding underneath his promise the whole time. He had promised her he'd always come home. But there were 200 people on this airplane, and every single one of them had someone waiting at some gate somewhere. 200 people with daughters and fathers and husbands and wives. And the only man on board who could give all of them a chance to come home was sitting in seat 5A with his eyes closed, hiding from himself. If I don't stand up, he thought, and this plane goes down and I could have done something, how do I come home to her? How do I look at my daughter knowing I let 200 people die to keep a promise she wouldn't even want me to keep? The answer arrived quietly, the way the most important answers always do. She wouldn't want this. She wouldn't want me to sit here. She'd want me to be the man she drew in crayon. Ethan opened his eyes. Grace Okafor had reached row 5 in her second desperate pass down the aisle, and she was about to move past when the man in the leather jacket, the man everyone had been afraid of, the man whose photo the teenager in the back had sneaked, reached out and touched her sleeve. She stopped. He looked up at her, and the thing that struck Grace in that moment, the thing she would tell people about for the rest of her life, was that the fear was completely gone from his face. Everyone else on this airplane was drowning in it. But the biker in 5A looked calm. Terribly, impossibly calm. Ma'am, Ethan said quietly, I can fly this airplane. Grace stared at him. Around them, heads turned. The woman in 5B lowered her magazine. The businessman across the aisle went still. The whole forward cabin, which had heard the words, seemed to hold its breath at once. I'm sorry, Grace said. Ethan unbuckled his seatbelt. The click was very loud in the silence. I was a combat pilot, he said. United States Air Force, 12 years. I've got more hours in more emergencies than the man up front has got hours total, and no offense to him, but right now that's what matters. He held her gaze. Your first officer asked for anybody with flight experience. I'm your anybody. Take me up front, now. For one heartbeat, Grace Okafor did the math that every human being on that airplane had been doing all day. She looked at the jacket, the beard, the patch, the tattoos, climbing up his neck, and some ancient, stupid part of her hesitated. And then 11 years and 4,000 flights spoke louder, and she thought, the polished ones cause the trouble. The rough ones help you lift the bag. Come with me, she said. Ethan stood, and 200 people watched the biker they had spent 5 hours despising rise out of seat 5, a step into the aisle and walk steady, unhurried, certain toward the front of a falling airplane. The woman in 5B watched him go. Her arms were still wrapped around her purse, and as the leather jacket disappeared through the forward curtain, she looked down at her own hands, at her white knuckles, at the way she guarded her little bag against a man who was at this very moment walking toward the cockpit to try to save her life. Something in her face crumpled. She had never in her life felt so small. Oh God, she whispered to no one. What have I? She didn't finish. Behind her, old Walter Hayes settled back into seat 4C, buckled his belt with shaking hands and closed his eyes and smiled a small, private smile, the smile of a man who has just watched one more time before the end of his life. Another pilot to stand up when it counted. Give him hell, son, he murmured. Dad. The forward curtain closed behind Grace, and she led Ethan the 6 short steps to the cockpit door and knocked the coded knock, and Ethan Walker, biker, outlaw, father ghost of a man he'd tried for 5 years to bury, felt the last of the leather jacket version of himself fall away layer by layer with every step. By the time the cockpit door opened, the man standing in the doorway wasn't Ethan the biker anymore. He was Captain Walker. And Captain Walker took one look through that open door at the unconscious body slumped against the sidewall, at the terrified young first officer white-knuckling the yoke at the master caution panel, glowing red at the altimeter, unwinding like a clock running backward, and the calm that settled over him was the deepest calm he had felt in 5 years. First officer, he said, and his voice filled the small space level and absolute. My name's Ethan Walker. I've got 12 years military time and I've done this before. I need you to talk to me and I need you to trust me. And between the two of us, we are going to put this airplane on the ground. You copy. Daniel Brooks, 31 years old and 3,000 hours and more frightened than he had ever been in his life, looked up at the tattooed stranger filling the cockpit doorway. The last man on earth he would have expected, and heard something in that voice that made his own hand stop shaking. Yeah, Daniel breathed. Yeah, I copy. Get in here, please get in here. Ethan stepped over the threshold, and somewhere 20,000 feet below the frozen white ground of the Yukon reached up, and the man everyone had misjudged sat down in the cockpit of a dying airplane, and for the first time in 5 years put his hands on the controls. Orchestrated, emotionally charged narrative with rapid pacing and psychological tension. Orchestrated, emotionally charged narrative with rapid pacing and psychological tension. The cockpit door sealed shut behind him with a soft pneumatic hiss, and just like that, Ethan Walker's whole world shrank to a space the size of a closet. Talk to me, he said, dropping into the empty left seat where Captain Mercer should have been. His hands found the yoke before his eyes finished sweeping the panel. Everything. Fast. What do we have? Number 2 engine. Daniel said the words tumbling out. Oil pressure went to 0 about 4 minutes ago. Temp spiked. I think it's seized or seizing. I had the checklist open when the captain, his voice broke. He grabbed his chest and he went down. He's not answering. I couldn't do the engine and hold the plane and check on him all at. You did fine, Ethan said. You held the airplane. That's the only job that mattered and you did it. Look at me. Daniel looked at him. You're not alone anymore, Ethan said. Copy. Something in the younger man's chest unlocked. Copy. Good. Now, number 2, shut it down. Full shutdown right now before it comes apart and takes the wing with it. You know the memory items? Yeah, I waved. Then do 'em. I've got the airplane. You run the shutdown. Go. You've got the airplane, Daniel repeated, and let go of the yoke, and Ethan felt the full weight of the crippled jet transfer into his hands. And in that first second of contact, everything Ethan had told himself for 5 years that he was done, that he was somebody new, that the pilot in him was dead and buried, came apart like wet paper. The airplane spoke to him through his palms. It was sick. It was dragging. It wanted to roll right toward the dead engine, and it wanted to sink, and it was fighting him for the nose. But it was flying. It was still flying. I've got worse than this, he thought. I've flown worse than this on fire. Fuel control number 2 cut off. Daniel called out, his hands moving now, training taking over. Firewall shut off, valve closed. Fire. I don't have a fire light. No fire. Thank God for small things, Ethan muttered. He fed in left rudder a steady pressure with his boot holding the nose against the pull of the dead engine. The yoke went a little easier. Okay, she's controllable. She's ugly, but she's controllable. What's our other engine doing? Number 1 looks good. Temps normal, pressure normal. Then we've got a flying airplane, Ethan said. No. 1 engine and a flying airplane. People have landed with less. He glanced sideways just for a fraction of a second at the slumped body against the sidewall. Captain Mercer's face was gray. His head lolled with the motion of the aircraft. Is he breathing? Daniel looked. His face went slack with dread. I can't tell. I can't tell from here. Ethan keyed the interphone without taking his eyes off the instruments. Grace, you there? The flight attendant's voice came back instantly. Right outside the door. I need two things, and I need them yesterday. One, get me that doctor, if you found one, into this cockpit for the captain. Two, prep that cabin for a possible emergency landing. Not now, soon, but I want them ready. Can you do that? The doctor's already up. I've got him standing by. And the cabin's been braced and ready since the captain went down. A beat. Sir, who am I talking to right now? Ethan almost smiled. You're talking to the biker from 5A, ma'am. There was the smallest pause on the line. Then copy that 5A, bring us home. The line clicked off. And in that one exchange, something happened that Ethan didn't have time to notice, but that Daniel Brooks noticed and never forgot the terror that had been sitting in his own chest like a stone, had shrunk down to something he could breathe around. Because the man in the leather jacket wasn't panicking. The man in the leather jacket was making a plan. Okay, Ethan said, first thing, where are we and where are we going? Pull up the nearest field. Talk to me about weather, runway, length, everything. Daniel's fingers flew across the flight management computer. Nearest suitable is okay, we've got a regional field about 40 miles behind us and south, but the runway's short 7,000 feet, and I don't love it, single engine. What's ahead of us on our route? Fairbanks, big field, long runways, but it's 110 miles out. Ethan did the math in his head fast, the way he used to do it, with fuel and fear and enemy radar all pressing in at once. 110 miles, single engine, descending a captain possibly dying in the seat behind him, or 40 miles back to a short strip he didn't trust. How's our fuel? Good, we're heavy on fuel we tankered for Anchorage. Then Fairbanks, Ethan said. Long runway, emergency equipment, room to be wrong. We take the extra 20 minutes and we get a field that gives us margin. He glanced at Daniel. You agree this is your airline, your airplane, your call as much as mine. You agree. And that question, that one question from a stranger who could have just seized command and never once asked, did more for Daniel Brooks in that moment than any reassurance could have. Because it told him he was still a pilot. He was still part of this. He wasn't a passenger in his own cockpit. I agree, Daniel said, and his voice was steadier than it had been since Mercer fell. Fairbanks, long runway, I'll get us the frequency and declare. Declare it loud, Ethan said. Mayday, not pan. I want every truck they've got rolling before we're on the ground. Go. Daniel keyed the radio. Anchorage Center, this is... He gave the flight number, and then for the first time in his career, he said the word that every pilot dreads and drills for. Mayday, mayday, mayday. We have an engine failure, number 2 shut down, and we have an incapacitated captain, a medical emergency in the cockpit, requesting immediate vectors and priority to Fairbanks. Souls on board 211 and standby on fuel. There was half a second of dead air. Then the controller came back, and to his credit, his voice didn't change at all. Aircraft declaring Mayday, Anchorage Center, roger, you are cleared direct. Fairbanks descend and maintain as required. I'm clearing the airspace ahead of you now. Say the nature of the medical emergency. Captain's unconscious, possible cardiac. We've got a physician passenger with him. Copy. Emergency services will be standing by. Say you're a pause, and now just barely the controller's professionalism cracked because he'd pulled up the crew list. Say again your flight deck crew. My paperwork shows 1 captain, 1 first officer. Daniel looked at Ethan. Ethan took the radio. Anchorage, the man flying your airplane is Ethan Walker, former United States Air Force. I'm a rated pilot, 12 years more emergency time than I'd like to talk about, and I was a passenger in seat 5A until about 90 seconds ago. He let that sit for exactly 1 second. Your first officer's flying the radios and the systems I'm flying the airplane, and we are a crew. We're going to need vectors, and we're going to need everybody on the ground to stay calm. Can you give me a clean approach into Fairbanks? The controller? A man named Pete Halverson, who had 31 years in the chair and would tell this story at his retirement party, took a breath and said, the thing he'd been trained never to editorialize and editorialized anyway. Mr. Walker, he said, I've got you a clean approach, and I've got the whole sky cleared out in front of you. And whoever the hell you are, welcome aboard. Let's get these people home. Ethan almost laughed. Almost. Copy Anchorage. Thank you. He handed the radio back to Daniel and put both hands on the yoke, and behind him the cockpit door opened and the doctor came in. He was younger than Ethan expected, maybe 40, with the calm, tired eyes of a man who'd worked a lot of night shifts. "I'm Dr. Annan," he said, already dropping to his knees beside Captain Mercer. "Emergency medicine. What happened?" "Grabbed his chest, went unconscious 4 or 5 minutes ago," Daniel said over his shoulder. "He hasn't moved." Dr. Annan pressed 2 fingers to the captain's throat. His face didn't change, but Ethan, who had spent a career reading faces, saw the exact half-second when the doctor found what he was looking for, and it wasn't good. "He's got a pulse," Annan said. "Weak, fast, thready. He's breathing, but it's shallow. This is a cardiac event, almost certainly. He needs a hospital now, not in an hour." "Fastest I can get him to a hospital is Fairbanks," Ethan said. "That's the whole ball game, Doc. That's the fastest. Can you keep him alive that long?" Dr. Annan looked up at the back of the biker's head, at the leather, the tattoos, the bandana, and if he felt any surprise at who was flying the plane, he didn't show it. "How long?" 40 minutes, maybe less if they let me push it." "Then push it," Annan said and turned back to his patient. "I'll keep him alive. You keep us in the air. Deal?" "Deal, are you seeing?" Ethan said. And for a moment, just a moment, the whole cockpit found its rhythm. The doctor working the captain. The first officer working the systems. The biker working the airplane. 3 strangers who 11 minutes ago had never met, bound now by the only thing that mattered, which was 211 people who wanted to see their families again. Then the airplane lurched. It was sudden and it was violent, a hard yaw to the right that snapped every head in the cockpit sideways, and the master caution screamed and a new light flared red on the panel, and Daniel Brooks said the 2 worst words a pilot can say. "Oh no." "Talk to me," Ethan said, already on the rudder, already fighting the yaw. "Daniel, talk to me. What is that?" "Number 1, Daniel's voice had gone white. "It's the oil pressure on number 1 is dropping. Our good engine. Our only engine. It's dropping just like number 2 did." For 1 terrible second, the entire cockpit went silent, except for the wail of the alarm. 2 engines, the same failure. On 2 different engines, within 20 minutes of each other. Ethan's mind, the cold, analytical part of it, that had kept him alive through 12 years of combat, seized on the one thing that didn't make sense. "That's not a coincidence," and he said. "Engines don't fail identically like that by accident. Daniel, what did we do before number 2 went? What did we change? Talk me through the last hour." "Nothing. It was a normal climb. We leveled off. Everything was..." "Fuel," Ethan said. "Think about the fuel. What's the fuel doing? What did the captain do with the fuel?" And Daniel Brooks, 31 years old and drowning, reached down into 3,000 hours of training and pulled up the one memory that saved 211 lives. "He balanced the tanks," Daniel breathed. "About an hour ago, Ray said the fuel was running uneven and he opened the crossfeed to balance it. He opened the crossfeed and oh God, he never closed it. We'd been feeding both engines off contaminated fuel," Ethan finished, and it all snapped into place. "There's water or junk in one tank, and the second the captain crossfed it, started poisoning both engines. Number 2 got the worst of it first. Now number 1's drinking it." His hands were flying now. "Close the crossfeed. Isolate the tanks. Feed number 1 off the clean side, whichever side didn't kill number 2. "Which side was it?" "Right tank," Daniel said, hands moving. "Number 2's on the right. The right tank's the bad one. Crossfeed closing, isolating, feeding number 1 off the left tank only." He stared at the gauge, and the whole cockpit stared with him, because if the left tank was clean, they lived, and if it wasn't, they had about 90 seconds to make peace with it. The oil pressure on number 1 wavered, dropped another notch, held. Then slowly, agonizingly, it began to climb back toward normal. "It's coming back," Daniel whispered. "It's coming back. The pressure's coming back." "Don't celebrate," Ethan said sharply, though relief had flooded his own chest like warm water. "That engine drank some bad fuel. It might be fine and it might quit on us with no warning. From this second on, we fly this airplane like number 1 could die any moment." "Copy." "Copy. Doc." Ethan didn't turn his head. "How's the captain?" "Holding," Dr. Annan said tightly. "Barely. Whatever you're about to do it gentle. His heart can't take a rough ride." Ethan almost laughed at that, a dry, exhausted sound. Gentle, he repeated. One engine, contaminated fuel, and a heart attack in the jump seat, and he wants gentle. He glanced at Daniel. You hear that, first officer? We're flying a hospital now. Smooth as glass all the way down. Smooth as glass, Daniel said. And that was the moment, with the crisis momentarily beaten back, with the good engine holding and the captain still alive, that Daniel Brooks finally allowed himself to really look at the man in the left seat, to take in the tattoos crawling up his neck, the worn leather, the winged skull he'd glimpsed as the man came in. And the question that had been buried under 20 minutes of terror finally surfaced. Can I ask you something? Daniel said. You can ask me anything except to stop flying. 12 years in the Air Force, combat pilot, more emergency time than you want to talk about. Daniel's eyes moved over the leather jacket. How does a man like that end up in the back of my airplane in a Hells Angels vest? And for the first time since he'd sat down, Ethan's hands tightened on the yoke and something crossed his face that Daniel couldn't read. Long story, Ethan said. Short version. I made a promise to my little girl 5 years ago that I'd never do anything dangerous again, that I'd always come home. He kept his eyes locked on the instruments. And I've kept it. 5 years. Not once did I break it. A muscle worked in his jaw. Until about 6 minutes ago when I stood up out of 5A. Daniel was quiet for a second. Why'd you break it? Ethan thought of the woman in 5B, clutching her purse, the mother and the toddler. The old pilot who'd looked into his soul and named what he was. 211 people, and every one of them somebody's whole world. Because she's got a dent, Ethan said quietly. And so does everybody back there. And I couldn't sit in that seat and let 200 people not come home just to make sure I did. He finally glanced at the younger man. She'll understand when she's older. She'll understand. He said it like a man trying to convince himself. Then the radio crackled, and Anchorage Center came back, and the moment closed. Walker, Anchorage. I've got you 80 miles from Fairbanks now. Fairbanks weather is holding ceilings good winds light, and down the runway, best news you're going to get in all day. But I got to tell you, Halverson paused. There's weather building to the north moving south, and it's moving faster than the forecast said. You've got maybe 40 minutes of clear before it socks in the field. You need to be on the ground inside that window. Ethan and Daniel exchanged one look. 40 minutes, Ethan said. We can make 40 minutes. You can make it if nothing else breaks, Daniel said. Then nothing else better break, Ethan said, and pushed the nose down a hair-trading altitude for speed, threading the needle between a dying engine that couldn't be pushed and a storm that couldn't be beaten. Anchorage, copy the weather. We're coming down. Keep that runway clear and keep talking to me. Every step of the way, Walker. Behind the cockpit door in the cabin, the 211 souls Ethan was fighting for had no idea about the contaminated fuel or the second engine or the storm racing them to Fairbanks. They knew only what Grace had told them, which was carefully, deliberately not the whole truth, that there was a medical situation that a qualified pilot was assisting, that they should stay calm and stay braced. But they could feel the airplane, they could feel it sinking, feel it yawing, feel the wrongness of it, and fear had spread through that cabin like smoke under a door. And in the seat 5, the woman who had clutched her purse against the biker was crying silently, both hands over her mouth, because Grace had let one thing slip when she passed, that the man who'd volunteered the man, now flying the plane, was the passenger from row 5. And the woman knew exactly which passenger that was. She knew she had pulled her bag away from him. She knew she had turned her body from him like he was something dirty. And now he was the only reason she might live. Miss, she said, catching Grace's sleeve on the next pass. Her voice shook. The man flying the plane, the one from my row, is he really? He's really flying us home, Grace said gently. Yes. The woman pressed her hand harder against her mouth. I was so awful to him, she whispered. I never said a word to him. I just moved my bag like he was oh God, and now he's... Ma'am, Grace crouched down beside her and put a hand over the woman's trembling hands. Listen to me. Whatever you're feeling right now, you fold it up and you put it away and you keep it. And when we're on the ground, you go find that man and you say it to his face. Okay, he's earned that. And you'll feel a whole lot better giving it to him than carrying it. She squeezed. But right now, I need you calm because the calmer you are, the calmer the folks around you stay, and calm is what's going to get us all down safe. Can you do that for me?" The woman nodded, wiping her eyes. "What's his name, the pilot? Do you know his name?" "Ethan," Grace said. "His name's Ethan." "Ethan," the woman repeated like a prayer and folded her hands in her lap and stared at the seat back and started silently to pray. Up front, the airplane was passing through 18,000 feet when number one coughed. It was a small thing, a hiccup, a single stutter in the smooth drone of the only engine keeping them alive. But every man in that cockpit felt it in the pit of his stomach, and Dr. Annan looked up from the captain, and Daniel's hand froze over the panel, and Ethan's whole body went rigid. "No," Daniel breathed. "No, no, no." "Watch it," Ethan snapped. "Watch the gauges. Talk to me." The engine stuttered again. The pressure needle twitched. "It's the fuel," Daniel said, his voice climbing. "There's still contaminated fuel in the lines from before it's working through if it gets into the—" "Then we ride it out," Ethan said, iron in his voice. "That engine's gonna cough and sputter and scare the hell out of us, but the good fuel's feeding it. Now we just gotta let it clear the bad stuff out of the lines. You do not touch that engine. You do not shut it down. You let it run rough. A rough engine's a running engine. Copy." "Copy." The engine coughed a third time harder, and the whole airframe shuddered, and somewhere behind the door, a passenger screamed, and Dr. Annan grabbed the captain to keep his head from banging against the wall, and for 3 full seconds, the number one engine sounded like it was tearing itself apart, and then it cleared. The stutter smoothed. The drone came back steady and full and beautiful. The pressure needle climbed and held. Daniel Brooks let out a breath that was almost a sob. "It cleared. Oh my God, it cleared. It's smooth. It's—" "See," Ethan said, and there was the ghost of a grin under his exhaustion. "Rough engine's a running engine. Bad fuel's through the lines now. We should be clean the rest of the way down." He keyed the interphone. "Grace, that shudder, they just felt that was the engine clearing itself out. It's normal. Tell them it's normal. Everybody's fine. We're fine." "Telling them now," Grace's voice came back. "And Ethan, the cabin can hear it in your voice, you know. You sound like a man who's done this before. It's keeping them calm. Whatever you're doing back there, keep doing it." Ethan didn't answer that. He couldn't quite. Because the truth was that a man who'd done this before was exactly what he was. And he'd spent 5 years pretending he wasn't, and there was something breaking loose in his chest right now. Something he didn't have time to look at that felt almost like grief and almost like coming home. 60 miles, Daniel said. 60 miles to Fairbanks, descending through 14,000. "How's the storm?" Daniel checked. His face tightened. "Moving faster than they said. Anchorage say the weather at Fairbanks." Halverson came back and his voice had changed. The easy confidence had thinned out. "Walker, I'm not going to lie to you. That weather's ahead of schedule. Ceiling at Fairbanks is dropping. You had 40 minutes of clear. You've got maybe 20 now. Wind's picking up, and it's starting to shift crosswind on you. You need to fly it like you mean it." Ethan's jaw set. 20 minutes. "Daniel, can we make Fairbanks in 20 minutes? Daniel ran the numbers, and his silence was its own answer. "Daniel." "It's going to be close," Daniel said. "It's going to be real close. And if the crosswind builds much more single engine into a short window with a captain who can't take a rough landing." He looked at Ethan. "I'm not going to sugarcoat it. This is the hard part. Everything up till now was easy compared to this." Ethan Walker looked out the front glass at the gray wall of weather building on the horizon at the airport somewhere behind it that meant survival at the shrinking window of clear air between him and 211 people coming home. And then he did something he hadn't done in 5 years. He reached into his jacket over his heart and he pulled out the creased photograph of a gap-toothed little girl holding a crayon drawing, and he wedged it into the corner of the instrument panel where he could see it. "Lily, my dad." "What's that?" Daniel asked. "That's my reason," Ethan said. "Everybody's got a reason. That one's mine." He put both hands back on the yoke, and his voice dropped into a register Daniel hadn't heard from him yet. Lower, harder, absolutely certain the voice of a combat pilot who has looked at a bad situation and decided simply that it is not going to beat him. "All right, first officer, here's how this goes. We're going to beat that storm to the runway. We're going to fly the smoothest, cleanest, single-engine approach that field has ever seen, gentle enough that the captain's heart doesn't skip a beat, And we are going to put 211 people back on the ground with their families tonight. He glanced one last time at the photo of his daughter. Every one of them, he said softly, is going to come home, because that's the promise now. Not just me, all of them. Daniel Brooks stared at the man in the leather jacket, the biker everyone had ignored. The outlaw the whole cabin had feared, the ghost of a captain who'd risen out of seat 5A and felt something he hadn't felt since Ray Mercer collapsed 40 minutes ago. He felt like they were going to make it. Fairbanks in sight, he said, his voice thick. I've got the field, dead ahead through the gap in the weather. Runway's clear, trucks are rolling, they're waiting for us. Then let's go get it, Ethan said. And he pointed the nose of the dying airplane at the narrowing seam of clear sky, one engine turning a captain's life in the balance behind him, a storm closing in from the north, and the face of his daughter watching him from the corner of the panel, and began the descent that every soul on board Flight 1487, whether they knew his name or not, was praying he could fly. The nose came down and the airplane began to fall toward the narrowing seam of clear sky, and for the first 30 seconds it went exactly the way Ethan wanted it to go. Then the crosswind found them. It hit the tail like a shove from an open hand, and the airplane skidded sideways in the sky, and Ethan felt it try to weather vane, try to swing its nose off the line he'd drilled toward the runway. His boot came down on the rudder before his mind finished registering the drift. Wind's shifting on us, Daniel said, watching the instruments. It was down the runway 90 seconds ago. Now it's coming across, 15 knots, gusting higher. I feel it, Ethan said through his teeth. Anchorage, what's the surface wind at Fairbanks? Give me a number. Halverson's voice. Latest I've got is 270 at 18, gusting 26. That's a crosswind on your runway walker, right at the edge of what that airplane's certified for, and it's building. Daniel looked at Ethan, and he didn't have to say the thing they were both thinking. Certified crosswind limits were written for 2 good engines, 2 healthy pilots, a calm day, and a long runway. They had 1 engine a stranger and a shaken kid in the seats, contaminated fuel that could cough at any second, and a captain in the jump seat whose heart was hanging by a thread. That's a lot of crosswind for a single-engine approach, Daniel said quietly. It is, Ethan agreed. He didn't lie to the kid. He'd learned a long time ago that you don't lie to the man in the seat next to you when the stakes are this high. You tell him the truth, and you tell him you're going to beat it anyway. It's a lot of crosswind, and we're going to land in it, because the alternative is turning around and flying an hour to another field with a coughing engine and a dying captain, and I'm not doing that. We land here, we land in the crosswind. I've landed in worse. When Daniel asked, it wasn't a challenge, it was almost a plea. He wanted to believe him. Kandahar, Ethan said. Night, crosswind dust storm, and somebody shooting at the field. Compared to that, this is a Sunday drive. He almost smiled. The wind's the only thing trying to kill us today, Daniel. Just the wind, and the wind's never beaten me yet. That got a shaky laugh out of the younger man. And that laugh, that single cracked, exhausted laugh in the middle of the worst hour of Daniel Brooks's life, did more good in that cockpit than any checklist could have. Behind them, Dr. Annan had one hand braced against the sidewall, and the other pressed flat against Captain Mercer's chest, feeling the fluttering, uneven rhythm under his palm. How long, he said. How long until we're down? I need a number. 12 minutes, Ethan said, give or take. His heart's getting worse, Anon said flatly. I'll be honest with you both because you've been honest with me. He's slipping. The rhythm's going ragged. If this landing is rough, if you slam it down, if you have to go around and try again, I don't think his heart takes it. You get one shot, Ethan. You understand me. This can't be a landing where you touch down, decide you don't like it, and go around and try again. There is no again, not for him. The words landed in the cockpit like a stone dropped into still water. One shot, no go-around, single-engine building crosswind, shrinking weather window, a runway he'd never flown an airplane he'd never flown before 90 minutes ago, and now no second chance. Ethan Walker took one long breath. Copy, he said. One shot. I hear you, Doc. And something in his voice made both other men look at him because the fear that should have been there wasn't. There was only that terrible, bottomless calm, the calm Walter Hayes had seen and named back in the cabin, the calm of a man who had lived his whole adult life inside moments exactly like this one. Daniel, Ethan said, new plan. We don't do a normal approach. We can't afford a normal approach, not with one shot. So here's what we're going to do. You're going to be my second set of eyes and my second set of hands, and you are going to call out everything, every airspeed, every altitude, every wind shift, every warning, the second you see it and you don't wait for me to ask. If that engine so much as burps, you tell me. If the wind swings, you tell me. I'm going to be flying the airplane with everything I've got, and I need you to be my instruments. Can you do that? I can do that, Daniel said. I know you can. You've done everything right for the last hour. Now do this one last thing right and we all go home. Ethan's eyes were locked forward on the gray murk where the runway was hiding. Get me the approach set up. Gear when I call for it, not before. Flaps and stages, I'll call each one. And keep talking to Anchorage. I want that runway ours and only ours, and I want every truck they've got sitting on the grass waiting for us. Daniel's hands moved, and for the next 4 minutes, the cockpit became a single organism. 2 men breathing as one, calling and answering the biker flying, and the first officer feeding him the sky in numbers. 10 miles. Copy 10. Descending through 4,000. On the glide path. Little high correcting. Bring it down easy, don't chase it. Wind swinging back, coming down the runway a little more. I feel it, that's a gift, take it. 8 miles, trucks are on the grass. Anchorage confirms the runway's ours. Beautiful, gear down. Gear down. Daniel's hand hit the lever, and the whole airplane groaned as the landing gear extended into the slipstream and 3 green lights blinked on. Gear down and lock 3 green. Flaps to approach. Flaps to approach, speed checks. And it was going well. It was going so well that Ethan let himself believe for about 90 seconds that they were going to steal this one clean, that the wind was going to hold, and the engine was going to hold, and he was going to grease this crippled airplane onto the runway, and it was going to be against every odd easy. That was when the storm arrived early. It didn't build. It didn't creep. It slammed the field like a fist, and the clear seam Ethan had been threading closed in an instant, and the world outside the windscreen went from gray to nothing at all, a solid wall of driving snow and cloud that swallowed the runway, the approach lights, the ground, everything whole. I'm IMC, Ethan said sharply, his voice snapping tight. I've got no runway. I've got nothing. Where'd it go? Where's my runway? It's there. It's still there. We're 4 miles out, dead on the center line. Daniel said, his own voice climbing but holding. You're on the instruments now. Ethan, fly the instruments. The runway's right where it's supposed to be. You just can't see it yet. Anchorage, Ethan barked. The field just went to 0-0. The weather's on top of us early. Talk to me. Is that runway still open? Halverson's voice came back fast and grim. Walker, that squall line beat the forecast by 15 minutes. Fairbanks just went below minimums. Below minimums? Officially, you can't land there. Everything in the cockpit seemed to stop. Below minimums. It meant the weather was so bad that the rules said no airplane was allowed to attempt a landing. It meant a normal flight on a normal day would turn around right now and go somewhere else. But there was no somewhere else. There was a coughing engine and a dying captain and one shot. Anchorage, Ethan said very quietly, very evenly. Is there another field I can reach, anywhere, with better weather, that my engine and my captain can survive getting to? A pause. He could hear Halverson working. It could hear him pulling up weather and fuel and distances. No, Halverson said finally, his voice cracked. No, Walker. Everything in range is the same weather or worse, and nothing's close enough for your situation. Fairbanks is your field. Fairbanks below minimums is your field. I'm sorry. I wish to God I had better news for Yukon. And there it was, the bottom of the well. Below minimums weather, one shot, no alternate, no second chance, no way out, but down through a wall of white. He couldn't see through onto a runway. He couldn't see in a crosswind at the edge of the airplane's limits, with an engine that might quit and a captain who might die if he so much as bumped it on. Daniel Brooks turned and looked at the man in the leather jacket, and his face had gone the color of ash. Ethan, he said, what do we do? For a moment, one single human moment, Ethan Walker closed his eyes. And in the darkness behind his eyelids, he wasn't in the cockpit anymore. He was in a hospital hallway 5 years ago on the worst night of his life, kneeling in front of a little girl with a gap in her teeth. He heard his own voice making the promise, no more danger, baby, no more not coming home. I promise you. He saw her face. He saw the crayon drawing. He felt the exact weight of the vow he'd carried for 5 years and broken 90 minutes ago. And then in the dark, he heard something else. He heard the answer he'd found back in seat 5. And the thing that had gotten him out of the chair. She'd want me to be the man she drew. Ethan opened his eyes. We fly it down, he said. Ethan, it's below minimums. We can't see the... We fly it down, Ethan repeated, and his voice was steel now, was iron, was the voice of Captain Walker in the worst night of his war. Listen to me, both of you. I have landed airplanes I couldn't see out of. I have flown approaches to fields that weren't even supposed to exist. The runway is right where the instruments say it is. The instruments don't lie. I don't need to see the runway to fly to the runway. I need to trust the numbers and fly the numbers. And at the very last second, when we break out of this soup a few hundred feet off the deck, that runway is going to be sitting right there in front of us, exactly where it's supposed to be, and I'm going to land on it. He looked at Daniel. But I can't do it looking at gauges and looking outside both. So here's the deal. I fly the instruments. You watch for the ground. The instant you see runway, you see lights, you see anything you call it. Runway in sight. You be my eyes for the outside world, and I'll fly us to the spot where the outside world shows up. Can you do that? Daniel Brooks looked at the wall of white, swallowing the windscreen, and looked at the impossible thing this man was asking him to do, and looked at the strange, absolute calm in the biker's face, and he made a decision that he would be proud of for the rest of his life. He decided to trust him. Runway in sight, Daniel said. The second I see it, I've got you. Anchorage, Ethan said. We're landing at Fairbanks. Below minimums or not. It's the only shot my captain's got, and it's the only field my engine can make. Roll every truck you've got and say a prayer. We're coming down. There was a silence on the frequency, and then Pete Halverson, 31 years in the chair, did the only thing left to do. Fairbanks is all yours, Walker, he said, his voice thick. Winds 270 at 20, gusting 28. Every truck's rolling, and Ethan, bring 'em home. Bring 'em all home. That's the plan, Ethan said. He put the photograph of his daughter in the corner of his eye where he could see it, and he wrapped both hands around the yoke, and he began to fly the numbers. 3 miles, Daniel called. On glide path on center line, speed's good. Flaps full. Flaps full, speed checks. We're configured to land. Talk to me about the wind. 270 at 20 gusting. There's a gust 27 crosswind from the left. I've got it! And Ethan did have it. He'd crabbed the nose into the wind, holding the airplane pointed slightly off the runway, heading so the crosswind wouldn't blow them off. The center line flying sideways down an invisible line toward an invisible runway. Trusting the numbers, trusting the instruments, trusting 12 years and 10,000 hours and every terrible night that had made him who he was. 2 miles, descending through 800 feet. The airplane bucked in the turbulence, and Ethan rode it hands soft and firm, at once correcting, always correcting. 1 mile, 500 feet. Behind him, Dr. Anand had stopped talking. He had both hands on the captain now, and his eyes were closed and his lips were moving, and he was for the first time in a long time praying. 400 feet, nothing but white outside the glass. 300 feet, nothing. 200 feet, Ethan, I've got nothing I can't see. Keep looking, Ethan said dead calm. It's there, keep looking. 150 feet. And Ethan Walker felt the whole weight of it pressed down on him at once. The 211 souls, the dying captain, the daughter waiting in Anchorage. The promise, the storm, the one shot, and he did not flinch, and he did not blink, and he held the crippled airplane rock steady on the numbers as the ground rushed up unseen beneath him, and in the deepest, coldest, calmest part of himself, he thought a single clear thought. Come on, show me the runway. 100 feet. And then Daniel Brooks screamed the two most beautiful words in the English language. Runway in sight, runway dead ahead. We're on it. We're right on the center line, Ethan. We're on it. The wall of white tore open, and there it was, the runway, its lights blazing up through the snow, sitting exactly, precisely, impossibly where the instruments had promised it would be dead ahead, close rushing up real. I've got it, Ethan shouted, and every ounce of him came alive at once, the crab coming out the wing, dropping into the wind, the rudder straightening the nose, all of it in one fluid motion that no checklist could ever teach, that only 10,000 hours could put into a man's hands. And the airplane came down through the last 100 feet in the screaming crosswind. One engine turning, a captain's life in the balance, a little girl's face in the corner of his eye, and the wheels touched the runway. They touched so softly that for half a second, nobody in the cockpit believed it had happened. So gentle that Dr. Anon, hands on the dying captain's chest, felt the touchdown as nothing more than a whisper. A kiss, the lightest settling of weight onto wheels, the kind of landing that a healthy heart wouldn't have noticed and a failing one could survive. "We're down," Daniel breathed. "Oh my God, we're down, we're down." "Not yet, we're not," Ethan said, standing on the brakes, feeding in rudder, fighting the crosswind that was still trying to shove them off the icy runway, keeping the nose straight, bleeding off the speed. "Not till we stop. Talk to me. Keep me on the center line." "Center line's good. You're tracking. Straight brakes are working. We're slowing." The airplane thundered down the runway through the snow, decelerating. The engines roared, dying back, the whole crippled mass of it coming under control. Slower, slower, until at last, at the far end of the runway, in the middle of the storm, with red and blue lights of a dozen emergency trucks flashing through the white, all around them, Flight 1487 rolled to a full and complete stop, and the cockpit went silent. For a moment, none of the three men could speak. Then Dr. Anon said in a voice full of wonder, his heart still going, "That landing, I never felt it touch down." His heart never skipped. "You did it. You actually did it." Daniel Brooks put his face in his hands and made a sound that was half laugh and half sob, and his shoulders shook. And Ethan Walker sat in the captain's seat with his hands still on the controls, staring out at the flashing lights in the snow, and slowly, slowly he let go of the yoke. His hands were not shaking. He reached up and took the photograph of his daughter off the panel and looked at it for a long moment. The gap-toothed grin, the crayon letters. "My dad. I came home," he said quietly to her, to himself, to the ghost of the man he'd tried for 5 years to bury. "I broke the promise, and I still came home, and I brought everybody else home too." He pressed the photo to his lips for just a second and then tucked it back into his jacket over his heart. Then the interphone crackled, and Grace Okafor's voice came through, thick with tears she'd held back for 211 people for the last 90 minutes. "Flight deck," she said. "We're down, Grace," Ethan said. "We're stopped. Everybody's safe. Get your doors ready. We've got trucks all around us, and they're going to want that captain first." There was a pause, and then on the other side of that door in the cabin, Grace Okafor turned to face 211 passengers who had spent the last 90 minutes in silent terror, and she keyed the cabin PA, and she said in a voice that broke on the second word, "Ladies and gentlemen, we are safely on the ground at Fairbanks." And the cabin of Flight 1487 erupted. It was a sound Ethan could hear through the cockpit door, a roar, a wall of it cheering and weeping and shouting, and the high, thin wail of children who didn't understand why the grown-ups were crying, and under all of it, somewhere in row 5, a woman who had clutched her purse against a stranger was sobbing into her hands and saying a name over and over. "Ethan, Ethan, Ethan." And in the cockpit, Daniel Brooks lowered his hands from his face and turned to the man in the leather jacket. The biker. Everyone had ignored the outlaw. The whole plane had feared the ghost, who had risen out of seat 5A, and he found that he didn't have any words big enough. So he just held out his hand. Ethan looked at it, then he took it. "Thank you," Daniel said. It came out cracked, barely a whisper. There aren't thank you. You saved every single one of us." "We saved them," Ethan said. "You and me and the doc. Nobody does this alone, kid. Nobody ever did." He gripped the young man's hand hard. "You flew this airplane for the worst 4 minutes of your life before I've ever got up here, and you never let it fall. Don't you ever forget that. You're a good pilot, Daniel Brooks. You're a damn good pilot." Daniel couldn't answer. He just nodded, his jaw working, his eyes streaming. Outside, the emergency crews were already swarming the airplane, and the door was already opening, and the storm was still howling, and somewhere in the flashing lights, a paramedic was climbing aboard to take Captain Ray Mercer to a hospital that would in the end save his life, because a biker in seat 5A had put an airplane down so gently that a failing heart never felt it land. And through the cockpit window, through the driving snow, and the flashing red and blue, Ethan Walker looked out at the ground, the solid, safe, beautiful ground, and thought of the arrivals gate in Anchorage, where a 13-year-old girl was at that very moment waiting for a plane that she didn't yet know had almost never come. He was going to have to tell her. somehow. He was going to have to explain what he'd done and why he'd broken the promise. But that was a conversation for later. Right now, he just sat in the quiet of the cockpit with the cheering of 211 saved lives ringing through the door and let himself feel for the first time in 5 long years the thing he'd been most afraid to feel. He let himself feel like a pilot again. The paramedics came first. They came through the forward door before the jetway was even fully locked. 2 of them with a gurney moving fast and quiet, the way emergency people move when they know the clock is running. Ethan stepped back from the cockpit doorway and let them pass without a word, and they had Captain Mercer strapped and moving in under 90 seconds. Dr. Anon walked alongside, one hand still on the captain's wrist, talking low and fast to the lead paramedic, handing over everything he knew about the last 90 minutes. At the door, Mercer's eyes fluttered open for just a moment. He looked up at the ceiling of the airplane he'd flown for 30 years. He looked at the faces around him, and then his eyes found Ethan, the leather jacket, the tattoos, the face of a man he had never met, and something moved in the captain's expression. Confusion first, then slowly something else. Something that looked almost like recognition. Like the part of him that was still a pilot understood even through the fog of a heart attack what had happened. "Did you?" Mercer's voice was barely a breath. "Did somebody land my airplane?" Ethan crouched down beside the gurney so the old captain didn't have to raise his voice. "Yes, sir," he said. "Everybody's safe. All 211. Mercer closed his eyes and the faintest, most exhausted smile crossed his gray face. "Good," he managed. "Good landing." "Smooth as glass," Ethan said and meant it. "Good," Mercer said again and let the paramedics carry him away. Ethan stood and watched him go, and something tightened in his chest that he didn't have a name for. It wasn't grief and it wasn't relief. It was something in between, the particular ache of one pilot watching another be carried off his own airplane, knowing that the landing you're most proud of was one the other man would never remember making. Then Grace Okafor touched his arm. She had been standing behind him this whole time, and when he turned, he saw that her eyes were red, and her professional composure, the composure she had held so perfectly for 211 people for 93 minutes, had finally come undone, now that it was safe to let it. "Hey," Ethan said. "Hey, you did good. You kept that cabin together." "I didn't do anything," Grace said, and her voice shook on every word. "You did everything." "We did everything," Ethan said firmly, the same way he'd said it to Daniel, because it was the truth, and he needed her to hear it the same way Daniel had heard it. "The cabin was calm because you made it calm. The captain's alive because the doctor was there because you found him. I just flew the airplane. The airplane was the easy part." Grace laughed a watery, broken sound and said, "That is the most insane thing anyone has ever said to me." Before Ethan could answer, a sound began. It started as a murmur, low and building like a wave, gathering itself before it breaks. He could hear it through the open forward door, coming from the cabin behind the curtain. Voices, many voices rising together in a way that wasn't panic and wasn't conversation, but something altogether different. Something he'd never heard before on any flight he'd ever been part of. Grace looked at the curtain. "They know," she said. "I told them who flew us down when I made the PA. I told them it was the passenger from row 5. "Grace," Ethan said, and his voice carried a warning. "They wanted to know," she said simply. "They had a right to know." And she reached past him and pulled the curtain aside. He didn't want to go through it. He stood at the forward end of that aisle and felt the full weight of 200 pairs of eyes settle on him simultaneously, and every atom of him said to step back, say nothing, let them deplane and go home, and forget him. The same way the world had always forgotten him the second the leather jacket came into view. But the sound that came through the curtain stopped him. Because it wasn't jeering. It wasn't the nervous silence of people who'd spent the flight avoiding him. It was applause. Sustained, full-throated, 200-person applause, rising and rising until it filled the entire cabin and rattled off the overhead bins and hit him in the chest like a physical force. He stood in the doorway and let it wash over him, and the only thing he was sure of in that moment was that he was not going to cry. He had not cried since the night he made his daughter her promise, and he was not going to cry now, not here, not in front of 200 strangers. He was almost succeeding. Then he saw the woman from seat 5B. She was on her feet. She was 3 rows back, and she was looking directly at him, with a face so open and raw and devastated with shame that it hit him harder than anything else that had happened in the last 90 minutes. Her arms hung at her sides. Her purse was on the floor. Her chin was trembling. "I'm sorry," she said. She said it across the noise and the applause, and the whole length of those 3 rows said it loud enough that people around her went quiet to hear it. "I'm so sorry I judged you. I never gave you a single chance, and you." She stopped, pressed her lips together hard, tried again. "You saved my life. You saved every one of us, and I never even looked at you like a person." The applause had died down. The cabin was listening now. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. He looked at the purse on the floor and thought about the moment she'd lifted it into her lap, and he remembered every single time in his life a version of that gesture had been directed at him, every step back, every crossed arm, every whisper, and he felt all of it at once. And then he let all of it go. "Ma'am," he said, "when this plane lands, nobody goes home wondering if they did the right thing. That includes you." He held her gaze. "You go home. You hug whoever's waiting for you. We're good." The woman pressed her hand to her mouth and sat back down, and the woman beside her put an arm around her shoulders. Walter Hayes hadn't stood for the applause. His knees had stopped cooperating with standing ovations several years ago. But he was watching Ethan from seat 4C with those pale, sharp eyes, and when Ethan's gaze found the old pilot's, Walter did something deliberate and slow. He came to attention in his seat, straightened his spine, squared his shoulders, and raised one thin, trembling hand in a salute. Ethan Walker stood a little straighter, and he returned it. He held the salute for 3 seconds to a man he'd never met before today, a man who had seen him when everyone else was looking at a leather jacket, a man who had said the words that got him out of that chair. And the cabin watched the exchange in complete silence, feeling something pass between the 2 men that they couldn't quite name but understood completely the way you understand music you've never heard before. Then the moment ended, and passengers started gathering their bags, and the ordinary chaos of a deplaning aircraft took over, and Ethan stepped back out of the aisle to make room. Grace was beside him. "FAA's going to want to talk to you," she said quietly, "and the airline, and probably everybody else." "I know. There are news cameras outside. They followed the emergency trucks." Ethan closed his eyes briefly. "Of course there are. You could go out the back." He shook his head. "I don't hide," he said. It came out more bluntly than he intended, and he heard in his own voice something that hadn't been there 5 years ago, something that had come back in the last 90 minutes along with everything else. "Not anymore." He pulled out his phone. He'd had it off since boarding old habit, and then no time, and when it powered on, it buzzed and kept buzzing. Missed calls, texts, notifications from numbers he didn't recognize, which meant it had already started. The news had moved faster than the airplane. There was a voicemail from a reporter. 2, a text from an old Air Force buddy that said only, "Is that you? The flight, please call me." And underneath all of it, the one that mattered. A text from Lily. "Dad, why is there news saying something happened to your flight? Are you okay? Please answer. I'm at the airport. Please answer, Dad." He called her before he'd finished reading it. It rang once. "Dad." Her voice hit him like the landing, sudden, real physical. "Dad, oh my God, I saw it on the news. They said a plane declared an emergency, and then somebody said a passenger flew it, and I knew. I knew it was you. I don't know how I knew, but I knew." "Baby." His own voice came out rougher than he wanted. "Hey, baby, I'm okay. I'm on the ground. Everybody's safe." Did you really, Dad? Were you the one who flew it?" A pause, one beat, because the thing he'd been dreading since the moment he stepped out of seat 5, A had arrived and he hadn't fully figured out how to say it, and his daughter deserved it straight. "Yeah," he said, "I was." Silence on the line. "Then you broke your promise." 3 words. 13 years old, and she put them together like a knife. "I did," Ethan said. "I broke it." Another silence. Longer. Ethan waited. "Are you hurt?" Lily asked. "No, not a scratch." "Is everyone okay on the plane?" "Everyone's okay. The captain's on his way to the hospital, but he's alive." A very long pause. And then Lily Walker, 13 years old, daughter of a biker and a ghost of a pilot, said something that unmade her father completely. "I'm glad you broke it," she said in a voice small and fierce and certain. "I'm so glad you broke it, Dad, because if you didn't, all those people—" She stopped. He could hear her breathing, could hear her gathering herself. You couldn't sit there. I know you couldn't. I wouldn't want you to, though. A pause. When are you coming? He closed his eyes. There's some stuff I have to deal with first. FAA, the airline. Could be a few hours. I'll wait, she said immediately. I'm not leaving. I'll wait as long as it takes. Lily, Dad. Her voice went quiet and absolutely steady, the voice of someone older than 13. Go do what you have to do. I'll be here. I've always been here. He stood with the phone pressed to his ear in the emptying galley of the airplane that had tried to kill 211 people and failed, and he felt the last piece of something he'd been carrying for 5 years, something heavier than the leather jacket and the patch and all the miles come loose inside him. I love you, baby girl, he said. I love you too, Dad, she said. Now go. He hung up. He stood up for a moment longer than he needed to. Then he squared the leather jacket on his shoulders and he walked to the forward door and he stepped out into whatever was waiting for him. The terminal was chaos. Airport security had tried to corral the news cameras to one side of the gate area, and they had largely failed because the passengers of Flight 1487 were coming through the door at a steady stream, and every one of them was talking, and the cameras were trying to talk to all of them at once, and above the noise, there was the particular electric hum of a story that had already escaped all the boxes anyone had tried to put it in. Daniel was waiting just inside the gate because someone from the airline had told him to stay put. He looked better than he had in the cockpit. His color had come back, the worst of the fear had burned off, but he had the hollow look of someone who'd come very close to something and was still processing how close. He saw Ethan come through the door and immediately stood up straighter. Hey, Daniel said. Hey, how's the captain? Alive, heading to surgery probably, but alive. Daniel nodded slowly. And the FAA wants us both. They've got a room in the back. The airline's lawyer is already in there, which means it's going to be a very long afternoon. He paused. You don't have to do this. You were a passenger. Technically, you can walk out that door and they can't make you. Daniel, Ethan said, I flew a commercial airliner without a type rating, without a current medical certificate, without authorization from the airline or the regulator, and I declared a mayday and violated weather minimums. They have a room with a lawyer in it because they need answers, and I'm the one who needs to give them. He almost smiled. I've never walked away from a debrief in my life. I'm not starting now. Daniel stared at him. Then he said quietly, you realize what you're walking into. They could pull your license. Whatever license you've still got, they could do a lot of things, Ethan said, and we can worry about that when we're in the room. But right now I need coffee. I need to know they're treating the captain right, and I need somebody to tell me the airplane is okay. He glanced at Daniel. Come on, walk me in. They walked in together, the biker and the first officer side by side, and every head in the gate area turned to watch them pass. A child ran up, maybe 4 years old, a little boy who had been on the flight, and grabbed Ethan's hand without a word, just grabbed it and held on for 3 seconds, while his mother caught up and pried him gently away. She looked at Ethan with a face that said everything she couldn't say out loud. He nodded at her. She nodded back. He kept walking. The room they'd been given was a standard airport operations conference room, and it held more people than should have fit comfortably. An FAA inspector named Carla Voss sat at the head of the table, a thin woman in her 50s with reading glasses pushed up on her head, and the expression of someone who had handled crises before, but perhaps not exactly this particular crisis. Beside her, an airline vice president named Henderson, who'd flown in from somewhere and was still wearing his overcoat. 2 more FAA people whose names Ethan didn't catch. A woman with a recorder, and at one corner of the table a lawyer who introduced himself as Burke, and then said nothing else. Ethan sat down without being invited to, which seemed to surprise everyone except Voss. Mr. Walker, Voss said. Miss Voss, Ethan said, because he had been in enough military briefings to know how to read a nameplate. Her eyebrow went up. You know who I am. You're the one who looks like you're running the meeting, Ethan said. You had the tablet open and the recorder ready before we walked in. So you're either FAA or NTSB, and you look like FAA. A very brief pause. You were Air Force. Combat pilot. 12 years. Then nothing for 5 years. He put his hands flat on the table. And before you ask, yes, I'm aware of what I did today. Yes, I flew a commercial aircraft without the required certifications. Yes, I violated multiple FARs, and yes, I would do it again. So if you're looking for an apology, you've got the wrong room. He held her gaze. But if you want the full debrief, every second of it, I'm here, and I'll give you everything. Henderson, the airlineman, a VP, leaned forward. Mr. Walker, I want to be clear that the airline's position, your airline's position, Ethan said without looking at him, is that without me, 211 of your passengers and crew were in a wreckage field right now instead of calling their families. So whatever position you walked in here with, I'd adjust it before you say it out loud. A silence that had some weight to it. Daniel Brooks, sitting beside Ethan, had the look of a man watching a gunfighter he'd hired who might also be about to shoot him. But Carla Voss was looking at Ethan with something different in her face now, something that had moved past the bureaucratic distance she'd walked in with. She was a pilot herself. She'd been a pilot herself before the desk, and she could read a debrief the same way Walter Hayes could read a cabin. Tell me about the fuel, she said. Ethan told her about the fuel. He told her about the crossfeed and the contamination and the way he'd caught it when number one began to drop. He told her about the crosswind and the minimums, and the one-shot approach told it in the flat, precise, minute-by-minute language of a cockpit debrief. No drama, no self-justification, just the facts and the decisions and the reasons for the decisions. He told it the way a man tells it who has stood in debrief rooms and knows that the only currency worth spending is accuracy. When he was done, Voss was quiet for a moment. The crossfeed contamination, she said. You caught it faster than most commercial crews would have. I've had worse, Ethan said. Military habit. Your instincts read the instruments differently. She made a note. And the approach, below minimums, one engine, crosswind at the top of the certified limit. Yes. You made the call to continue below minimums. That's a violation, Ethan said. I know what it is. And I made the call because the alternate options were all worse and the captain would not have survived the time needed to reach a clear field, and the engine was borderline enough that I wasn't willing to trust it for another 100 miles. He met her eyes. I made the call I would have made in the Air Force in the same situation. The rulebook says no. The situation said there's no other choice. In 12 years of combat flying, that math never gets easier, but the answer is always the same. Voss wrote something down. Henderson had gone very quiet. The landing, Voss said. What about it? Dr. Anand's report, the paramedics' report, says Captain Mercer experienced no additional cardiac stress during the landing. They're describing it as, she checked her notes, imperceptible. The roughest point of the entire approach was apparently the crosswind correction at about 200 feet, and they described that as a single moderate yaw, followed by complete stabilization. I had Daniel calling out the center line, Ethan said. We had a good team. Voss set her pen down. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she looked at Daniel, and then she looked back at Ethan. Mr. Walker, she said, I've been in this job for 19 years. I have debriefed a lot of flights. I have read a lot of incident reports. And I want to say something to you that will be off the record until I decide it isn't. She glanced at the woman with the recorder who paused it. What you did today, the decision-making, the crew coordination, the fuel diagnosis, the below minimums approach, the landing, it is not what I expected to be walking into when they told me a biker from seat 5A flew a 737 into a storm with one engine. I expected to be managing a disaster of a different kind. She paused. I was wrong. The room was very still. The FAA, she continued, has a process for everything, including this. Your certificates are going to need review. The below minimums call is going to need to be examined by people who outrank me. There are questions about liability and authorization and a dozen other things that Burke here is going to want to manage. She indicated the silent lawyer. None of that changes what happened today, and none of it changes what I just told you. Ethan nodded. Then Voss did something he hadn't expected. She picked her pen back up, wrote something on a card, and slid it across the table to him. That's my direct line, she said. When this process runs its course, and it will run its course, that's not a threat, it's just how it works, you call me. Because a man who can do what you did today in a machine he's never flown under those conditions is the kind of man this industry should not lose. He looked at the card, then he looked at her. Thank you, he said. It came out simpler than he intended and more honest. I'm not sure I want to go back to flying. I'm not sure I'm the same man I was before today. But thank you. You don't have to be the same man, Voss said. You just have to decide who you want to be next. It was, Ethan thought, the second time in one day someone had given him the exact answer he needed before he knew he was asking the question. They kept him for another 2 hours. The lawyer talked. Henderson talked. More FAA people came in with more questions. Ethan answered everything, repeated, nothing, corrected 2 factual errors in other people's tellings of the story, and at no point raised his voice. Daniel sat beside him through most of it and twice jumped in to confirm details, and once very quietly told the airline VP that if anyone in this room tried to make Ethan Walker the problem, here Daniel was going to have a conversation with the press that the airline would not enjoy. Ethan had not asked him to say that. Daniel said it anyway, and when Ethan looked at him, the younger man shrugged with the elaborate casualness of someone who had decided in the last few hours which kind of pilot he wanted to be. When it finally ended and Ethan stepped out of the operations room into the terminal, it was 4 in the afternoon, 3.5 hours after they'd landed, and the gate area outside the room had something in it that hadn't been there before. Passengers. Not deplaning passengers, not rushing to their connection passengers. These were people who'd been on Flight 1487, who had collected their bags and called their families and done everything they needed to do and then come back. And they were waiting. For him. Not all 211, maybe 60 or 70, enough to fill the gate area. They were sitting and standing and leaning against walls, and they had the particular exhausted, relieved, slightly dazed look of people who have faced something enormous and come out the other side and don't quite know what to do with the feeling. When Ethan came through the door, they went quiet. He stopped walking. For a long moment, nobody said anything. And then an older man in the back, a heavy-set man, Ethan hadn't noticed on the flight, a grandfather type with a Cardinals baseball cap, started clapping. Slowly first, like a heartbeat, and then the people around him picked it up, and then the people around them, and it built and built, and the gate area filled with the sound of it. Not the shocked, reflexive applause from the airplane, but something considered and deliberate, the applause of people who had had 3.5 hours to sit with what had happened and had decided to come back and give it. Ethan stood in the middle of it, and this time he didn't fight the feeling. He just stood in it and let it be real. A woman pressed through the crowd, middle-aged, dark coat, had been in the back of the plane. He didn't know her name. She walked up and held out her hand. "My daughter's getting married next month," she said very simply. "I need you to know that." He shook her hand. "Congratulations," he said. She nodded and stepped back, and someone else came forward, an older man. No words, just the handshake held a beat longer than necessary, the grip of a man who understood something and wanted Ethan to know he did. Then a young mother with a toddler on her hip, and the toddler held out a drawing done in the airport crayon on a napkin, wild and wobbly, but clearly an airplane, and clearly a stick figure in the cockpit. Under the drawing, in the mother's handwriting, but in the child's voice, "The man who flew us home." Ethan took it carefully. He held it next to his heart for a moment, right over the pocket where his daughter's photo lived, and something in his chest turned over very quietly. "Tell her thank you," he said to the mother. "She has no idea what happened," the mother said, looking at the toddler with wet eyes. "She just saw you walk out of the cockpit, and she said, 'Mama, that man has wings on his jacket.'" She paused. "She's not wrong, is she?" He looked down at the patch on his shoulder. The winged skull. The thing people had been seeing first for 5 years, seeing and fearing, and using to write the whole story of a man they'd never met. "Wings," he said, and almost smiled. "Yeah, I guess she's right." And then the crowd shifted, and Grace was there off duty now. Her uniform jacket exchanged for a sweater, her composed professional face finally completely off, and she put her arms around him the way a person holds on after something terrible has passed, not gently but hard and certain, the way you hold on to proof. He stood there and let her, because she had been the first person on the whole airplane who had looked at him like a person, and she had done it when it would have been easy not to, and that mattered more than she knew. "You good?" she asked his shoulder. "Working on it," he said. She laughed and let go and stepped back and looked at him with clear eyes. "For what it's worth," she said, "I knew. When you touched my sleeve, I already knew it was going to be okay." "How?" "Because scared men don't touch your sleeve like that," she said. "They grab, they pull, they demand. You touched my sleeve like a man who knew exactly what he was doing and just wanted someone to know he was ready to do it. She tilted her head. I've been flying for 11 years and I have never seen anything like what you did today. You kept 200 people from panicking, Ethan said. Don't sell that short. I told them the plane was fine, Grace said. You made the plane fine. There's a big difference. Behind her, old Walter Hayes was working his way through the crowd with his cane slow and steady, and people stepped wafting for him, with the automatic respect that age sometimes commands without asking for it. He reached Ethan and he stopped, and he looked up at him with those blue eyes that had seen 31 years of sky. Told you, Walter said. You did, Ethan said. People don't lose years of training just because they stop wearing the uniform. The old man's jaw shifted. How's it feel being back in the seat? Ethan thought about this. Thought about the moment the controls came alive under his hands, the way the airplane had talked to him, the way his body had remembered things his mind hadn't known he still knew. It felt like, he said slowly, coming home to a house you didn't know you missed until you were standing in the doorway. Walter nodded and something settled in his old face. Then don't stay away so long next time, he said. He patted Ethan's arm once, twice, the way you pat the arm of someone who has proven something important. And he turned and made his slow, careful way back through the crowd. Daniel was waiting at the edge of the gate area, standing slightly apart from the crowd with his hands in his pockets and the look of a man who has just had the defining day of his career and isn't sure yet if he's supposed to feel proud or terrified or both. Hey, Ethan said. Hey. You need to go home, Ethan said. You've been awake since, 4 a.m.? 3:30, Daniel said. He stared at the floor, then looked up. I keep seeing it, the panel, the captain going down. That moment when the weather closed and I didn't know if... That doesn't go away, Ethan said quietly. Not the first time, not completely, but it changes. It becomes something you carry differently. He met the young pilot's eyes. You did your job today, Daniel. Under the worst possible conditions with no backup in an emergency nobody could have prepared you for. You held the airplane, you ran the checklists, you coordinated the radios, you called the runway at exactly the right second. You were a first officer today in the truest sense of that word. You were first class. Daniel's throat worked. He swallowed hard. I was terrified, he said. I know, Ethan said. That's what makes it mean something. He stuck out his hand. Go home. Hug whoever you've got. Come back to it when you're ready. And the next time you're in that seat and it gets hard, you remember today and you remember you got through it. You remember what you're made of. Daniel shook his hand and held it for a moment. Are you going to keep flying? And he asked. Ethan looked at him. He thought about Carla Voss's card in his pocket. He thought about the feeling of the controls coming alive under his hands. He thought about the house he hadn't known he missed until he was standing in the doorway. I don't know yet, he said honestly. I've got a 13-year-old waiting for me at the other end of a flight I still have to get on. And I've got some things to figure out. He let go of Daniel's hand. But I'm not ruling anything out. Daniel nodded. For what it's worth, he said, if I ever have an emergency again, I want the biker from 5A. Ethan laughed a real laugh, short and genuine, the first real laugh that had come out of him all day. Let's hope you never need him, he said. He picked up his small duffel bag from where someone had set it near the gate counter, and he looked around the gate area one last time at the 60-some passengers who had come back at the drawing on a napkin tucked against his chest at the empty seat where Walter Hayes had been before the old man left at Grace Okafor, talking to a young mother near the window at Daniel Brooks, standing alone with his hands in his pockets and the whole rest of his career ahead of him. He thought about the woman in 5B who had clutched her purse. He thought about her face when she said, I judged you. He thought about the teenager in the back who had taken a sneaky photo of the dangerous biker and whether that teenager would look at the photo differently now. He thought about all the small, quiet ways the world had been telling him for years, exactly who it thought he was. And he thought about the 93 minutes when none of that had mattered, even slightly, when the leather jacket and the tattoos and the patch had been the least important things in the room, and all that had counted was whether the man wearing them could fly. He had flown. Ethan Walker shouldered his bag and walked toward the ticket counter to rebook his flight to Anchorage, and the crowd parted for him in a way that had nothing to do with fear. The ticket counter agent looked up when Ethan reached the front of the line, and he watched her do the thing, the half-second scan the jacket, the patch, the tattoos, and he watched her catch herself doing it, and he watched the moment she decided it didn't matter. "Can I help you, sir?" "I need to rebook," Ethan said. "I was on 1487, Anchorage." She was already typing. Then she stopped. She looked up from the screen with a different expression, entirely the same one Grace had worn, the same one Voss had worn, the look of someone who has just connected a name to a story. "Walker," she said quietly. "Ethan Walker." "Yeah." She stared at him for a moment. Then she said very carefully, as though she didn't want to get it wrong, "The next flight to Anchorage leaves in an hour and 40 minutes. I'm putting you in 1A. A pause. "No charge, and if anyone gives you any trouble about that, they can talk to me." Ethan opened his mouth. "Please," she said, "let me do this." He closed his mouth. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you," she said back, and meant something entirely different by it, and they both understood the difference and left it at that. He found a seat at a gate that wasn't his for the next hour and 40 minutes, somewhere quiet, away from the cameras that were still working the terminal, away from the lingering passengers from 1487 who were slowly dispersing into the airport. He sat with his duffel between his feet and the napkin drawing tucked into his jacket beside his daughter's photograph and Carla Voss's card in his breast pocket, and he tried to figure out what he felt. It turned out to be complicated. There was relief, obviously. The enormous animal relief of something terrible ending without the worst outcome, the particular exhaustion that only comes when your body has been running on pure adrenaline for 90 minutes, and the adrenaline has finally stopped. His hands, which had held steady on the controls through a crosswind approach below minimums in a storm, were trembling slightly now that there was nothing left to hold. That was normal. He knew that was normal. The body waits until you don't need it anymore, and then it falls apart just long enough to remind you it was scared the whole time. But underneath the relief, there was something harder to name. Something that had been sitting in his chest since the moment Carla Voss slid her card across the table and said, "You don't have to be the same man." Something that had been cracked open when the controls came alive under his hands, and the airplane spoke to him as though no time had passed. Something that Walter Hayes had started when he looked at Ethan Walker in seat 5A and said the thing nobody had said to him in 5 years. "I know what I'm looking at. I'm looking at a pilot." For 5 years, Ethan had told himself a story. The story was, "I was a pilot, and I chose to stop, and stopping was the right choice, and the man I was before is gone." He had told it so many times and so completely that he had almost believed it. He had poured it over his grief and his guilt and his loneliness like concrete, and he had built a life on top of the concrete, the chapter, the brothers, the rides, the weekends with Lily, and it was a good life. He didn't have a word against it. But today, in the space of 93 minutes, the concrete had cracked, and what had come up through the cracks wasn't the ghost he'd buried. It was something alive. Something that had never stopped being alive just because he'd stopped letting himself feel it. He sat with that for a long time. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. It was a name he hadn't expected: Marcus Webb. Captain Marcus Webb, now retired, who had been his squadron commander at the Air Force Base where Ethan's career had ended. The man who had signed the papers when Ethan walked away. The man who had known everything: the mission, the decision, the reason, the promise to Lily, and who had never once tried to talk him out of it, and who had shaken his hand at the gate and said, "You're the best I ever flew with, Walker. Don't waste it." 5 years of silence. And now this. The text said, "Saw the news." Every word of it. The cross-feed call, the below minimums approach, the landing, a pause in the typing, the 3 dots. "Then I always knew you'd fly again. I didn't know it would be like this. You okay?" Ethan stared at the message for a moment. Then he typed back, "Getting there. How'd you know it was me before they released the name?" Marcus replied in under 10 seconds. "Because no one else I ever flew with would have caught a cross-feed contamination by feel in an airplane they'd never sat in before. That was you before you ever opened your mouth. Get home safe. Call me this week." Ethan set the phone face down on his knee and looked at the ceiling. He was still looking at the ceiling when the gate area began to filter his flight, and he was still thinking about Marcus Webb and Carla Voss and the card in his breast pocket, and the thing that had come up through the cracks when a voice beside him said quietly, "Is this seat taken?" He looked over. It was the woman from seat 5B. She was standing there with her carry-on and her coat and her purse. The purse she had clutched against him for 5 hours, the purse she had put in her lap when he sat down, The purse she had in the end left on the floor of the airplane when she got to her feet to say she was sorry. She looked like someone who had been crying and had stopped and wasn't sure if she was going to start again. "I saw you sit down over here," she said. I I almost didn't come. I almost just got on my flight. But then I thought," she stopped. "The seat, is it taken?" "No," Ethan said. "Sit down." She sat. She put her purse in her lap and then caught herself and looked at it and set it on the floor between her feet instead. The gesture was so deliberate, so conscious, so clearly an act of will that Ethan had to look away for a second. "My name is Carol Briggs," she said. "I'm a third-grade teacher. I'm from Denver. I was going to Anchorage for my sister's 50th birthday." She folded her hands in her lap like someone in a confessional. "And I spent 4 hours on an airplane treating you like a threat, and then you saved my life when I went to the hotel across the street and sat on the bed and thought about what kind of person I want to be, and I came back." Ethan looked at her now, really looked. She was maybe 60 with kind eyes that had been crying in them, and silver hair that had come loose from where she'd pinned it. She looked like somebody's mother, which she probably was, and like somebody's sister, which she definitely was. And she looked most of all like a person trying very hard to do something right after doing something wrong. "Mrs. Briggs," Ethan said. "Carol." "Carol." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it, and keep it because I mean it. When you pulled your purse up, I noticed. I always notice. I've been noticing that specific thing from people I've never met for 5 years. And I won't tell you it didn't sting. It always stings." He paused. "But the reason it always stings is because it's always about what you see, not who I am. And I've spent 5 years being angry about that in a general low-level way that I've never done anything with." Carol Briggs was watching him very carefully. "Today," Ethan said, "change something, not because of the applause or the thank yous or any of that, but because for 93 minutes, nobody on that airplane cared what was on my jacket. They cared what was in my hands. And I hadn't felt that in a long time." He looked at her. "So what you did this afternoon, coming back to find me and say what you said, that means something. Not because I needed an apology, but because it takes something to do that. It takes a person who looks at themselves honestly, and that's rarer than you think." Carol Briggs pressed her lips together. Her eyes were bright. "I teach 8-year-olds, she said. "Every year I tell them don't judge a book by its cover. Every year. It's in my classroom, on a banner." She let out a breath that was almost a laugh, but hollower. "And then I sat down next to a man who scared me because of how he looked, and I never even said hello, after 30 years of telling children not to do exactly that." "You said hello today," Ethan said. "It's a little late." "Better late than the alternative," Ethan said. "Trust me, I've seen the alternative up close." She almost smiled, and then something shifted in her face, a thought crossing it like a shadow, and she said, "Your daughter, I heard you on the phone. You said her name, Lily." "Yeah. Is she okay? Does she know what happened?" "She knows," Ethan said. "She was watching the news at the airport. She'd been watching for an hour before I could call her." He felt the familiar tightening in his chest when he thought about those hours Lily at the gate in Anchorage watching the news crawl, knowing the flight number, knowing her father was on it, not knowing anything else. "She's okay." "How old is she?" 13. Carol looked at him for a long moment. "She must be an incredible kid," she said, "to have a father like you." "She's better than I deserve," Ethan said simply. "She always has been." A gate agent's voice came over the PA boarding announcement, "Anchorage first class and military personnel." Ethan picked up his bag. Carol Briggs stood at the same time and she held out her hand and he shook it. "Thank you, Ethan," she said, "for coming forward, for standing up, for," her voice caught, "for giving my sister her birthday." He held her hand for a moment. "Tell her happy 50th from me," he said. She laughed, a real one with some life in it, and nodded and let go. He walked to the gate. And the agent scanned his boarding pass, and Ethan Walker stepped onto the jetway of another airplane bound for Anchorage. And for 1 second, just one, he stood at the top of the jetway where the smell of jet exhaust and recirculated air hit him all at once, and he felt the whole day settle over him like a coat, all of it, every second, from the moment he boarded 1487 to the moment he stood here and he breathed it in. Then he walked down the jetway and found the seat 1A and sat down. He slept for the first time since Denver. He didn't dream, or if he did, he didn't remember it. He woke when the wheels touched down in Anchorage, and for one disoriented second, he heard the touchdown and felt for the yoke. And then he realized where he was and what he was holding the armrest, just the armrest, and he let go, and the airplane rolled to the gate and the seatbelt sign went off. He was the last one off. He came up the jetway and through the door and into the arrivals hall, and he didn't have to look for her because she found him first. She was through the barrier before the security guard could say anything about it, running flat out the way only a 13-year-old can run, all legs and certainty and absolute, no doubt about it, urgency. And she hit him so hard he took a step back. And then his arms closed around her, and he just held on. She didn't say anything for a long time. Neither did he. He could feel her shaking just slightly. Just the tremor that's left after you've been terrified for 3 hours, and then relieved, and then you can finally let the shaking out because the person you were terrified for is holding you. He tightened his arms and let her shake. "I watched it," she said finally into his jacket. "On the news. They had a reporter at Fairbanks. They showed the plane, the trucks, the storm. They said a passenger flew it." A pause. "I knew it was you before they said your name." "How?" "Because." She pulled back just far enough to look up at him. Her face was tear-tracked and fierce and absolutely his. "Because you're you, Dad. Because when something goes wrong and someone needs help, you don't sit down. You stand up. You've always been like that, even when you were pretending not to be." He looked at his daughter, at the face he'd been flying toward for 93 minutes, at the gap that wasn't there anymore because she was 13 and her baby teeth were gone, but her eyes were exactly the same eyes that had looked at him in a hospital hallway 5 years ago when he made a promise. "I broke it," he said. "I broke the promise." "Dad." Her voice was patient and exasperated in the way that only a teenager talking to a parent can be. "I was 8 when you made that promise. I'm 13 now. I'm different." She looked at him steadily. "You made that promise because you thought keeping yourself safe was the most important thing you could do for me. But the most important thing you can do for me is be the person you actually are, not a person you made up to stay safe." She reached up and put a hand against his chest over the pocket where the photograph lived. "I know what's in there. I know you carry that picture. And I know why." She held his gaze. "That picture is not asking you to be less. It never was." Ethan Walker stood in the Anchorage arrivals hall in a worn leather jacket with a winged skull on the back, and he looked at his daughter and he had nothing to say. Which was fine because she wasn't done. "Are you going to fly again?" she asked. Direct, no preamble, 13 years old and asking the exact right question. He thought about Carla Voss's card. He thought about Marcus Webb's text. He thought about the way the airplane had spoken to him through his palms, the way the instruments had made sense in a way nothing else had, and in 5 years, the way Daniel Brooks had looked at him and said, "I want the biker from 5A. He thought about the house you didn't know you missed until you were standing in the doorway. "I don't know yet," he said. "Maybe." Lily tilted her head. "Good," she said. "Maybe is better than never." She took his hand the way she used to when she was small, and she started walking him toward the exit, and he let her lead. "One condition," she said, not looking at him. "What's that?" "If you go back to flying, you teach me." She glanced up. "Not now, when I'm old enough. You teach me. Deal." Something moved through Ethan's chest that he recognized this time. He'd felt it an hour ago on the flight deck of a plane he'd brought out of a storm, and he'd felt it the first time he'd soloed at 22 years old, and he'd felt it the night Lily was born. It was the feeling of something beginning. "Deal," he said. She squeezed his hand once hard and then let go with the casualness of a teenager who has gotten what she wanted and pulled out her phone with the other hand, already texting someone. A friend probably, or her aunt, or someone who'd been worrying. And Ethan walked beside her and watched her type, and thought not for the first time and not for the last that she was so far ahead of him, it was almost funny. Outside the terminal, Ethan's phone rang. He looked at the screen. It was a number he didn't recognize, but the area code was Washington, D.C. He almost let it go to voicemail. Then he answered. "Walker," he said. "Mr. Walker." The voice on this other end was measured and deliberate, the voice of someone accustomed to choosing words with precision. "My name is Richard Calloway. I'm calling from the FAA's Office of Aviation Safety. I'm not going to take much of your time tonight. I know what kind of day you've had." A pause. I've spent the last 4 hours on the phone with Carla Voss, with Pete Halverson in Anchorage Center, with Dr. Anand, and with First Officer Brooks. I've also pulled your Air Force records, which are substantial. Mr. Calloway, Ethan said carefully, let me get to the point. What you did today was technically unauthorized. It also prevented what would almost certainly have been a catastrophic hull loss with major casualties. Those two facts create an interesting situation for us. Another pause. There is a process, not a common one, by which the FAA can, in cases of exceptional demonstrated competency under emergency conditions, expedite the review and reinstatement of commercial certifications. Normally, this process takes months or years. Calloway's voice shifted just slightly. I've been authorized to tell you that in your case, we would like to accelerate it considerably. Ethan had stopped walking. Lily, 3 steps ahead of him, turned and looked back, reading his face with the accuracy of a daughter who had learned to read her father the way he'd learned to read instruments. What does considerably mean? Ethan said. It means that if you want to fly again, commercially, professionally, any capacity, the doors are open. That's what it means. A pause. I'll have Carla send you the details. She's been advocating for you since she walked out of that debrief, loudly. Something in the voice that might have been amusement. She said, and I'm quoting directly, we would be idiots to lose this man again. I tend to agree with her. Ethan Walker stood outside the Anchorage terminal in the cold Alaska evening air, and he looked at his daughter, looking at him, and he thought about everything the day had taken apart and everything it had put back together, and he thought about a promise he'd broken and a promise he'd kept, and he thought about a house you didn't know you missed until you were standing in the doorway. Tell Carla I'll call her, he said. I'll tell her, Calloway said. Welcome back, Captain Walker. The line went quiet. Ethan stood for a moment with the phone at his side. Lily waited. She had all the patience in the world when she needed to this girl. Another thing she'd learned from him, or maybe despite him, or maybe just on her own. She watched him with her steady 13-year-old eyes. Good call, she said. Interesting call, Ethan said. Are you going to tell me what it was? He looked at her. He thought about all the ways to say it carefully, slowly, with footnotes and conditions and all the appropriate uncertainty. Then he decided that his daughter had earned a straight answer, and he gave her one. The government wants to give me my wings back, he said. Lily Briggs did not scream. She did not jump. She was 13, not 8, and she handled things with the dignity of someone who had already decided she knew this was coming before it arrived. She just looked at him for a long, clear moment, and then she said, Okay. Okay, he repeated. That's all. What do you want me to say? I told you maybe was better than never. She tilted her head. Are you going to take it? He looked up at the Alaska sky, dark and vast and full of stars that pilots learn to navigate by before they ever touch a control. He thought of the last 9 hours. He thought of Walter Hayes, who saw the pilot in the biker before anyone else had the eyes to look. He thought of Daniel Brooks, who had trusted a stranger with his life and the lives of 200 souls. He thought of Grace Okafor, who had smiled at him when no one else did. He thought of Carla Voss, who had slid a card across a table and said, Who you want to be next? He thought of Captain Mercer, who had smiled the faintest, exhausted smile and said good landing before they wheeled him away. And he thought about what he'd told Daniel when it was over. Nobody does this alone. Nobody ever did. He hadn't done any of it alone. Not today. Not 5 years ago. Not any of it. He had thought for a long time that the hardest thing about being who he was, the biker, the outlaw, the man the world looked at and wrote off, was the loneliness of being misread. But the harder thing the thing today had cracked wide open was that he had participated in his own disappearance. He had taken the leather jacket and used it the same way everyone else did, as a reason to not be known. He had hidden Captain Walker inside the Hells Angels patch and called it a choice and called it a promise, and never quite admitted to himself that what it really was fear. Fear that if he climbed back into a cockpit, he would lose something again. Fear that the part of him that could fly was also the part of him that could get killed. Fear that you couldn't be a pilot and a father, a man of action, and a man of presence, the person his daughter needed and the person he actually was. Today had answered that fear. Today had answered it completely in the most definitive possible way. He had been both. He had been all of it at once, the biker and the captain, the father and the pilot, the man who made a promise, and the man who broke it for the right reasons, and the man who came home anyway. He had been all of it at the same time, and the airplane had landed and everyone had come home. You don't have to choose between who you were and who you want to become. He had read that somewhere once, or maybe he had always known it and only now believed it. He looked down at Lily. "Yeah," he said, "I'm going to take it." She nodded once, the nod of someone filing away a fact they already knew. Then she bumped his shoulder with hers. "Good. Now, can we go get food? I've been at this airport for 6 hours, and all they have is bad pretzels." He laughed. That same short, genuine laugh from the gate area, and it came easier this time. "Yeah," he said. "Let's go get food." They walked to his truck. The Harley was home. He'd flown out, so it was the truck tonight, and Lily climbed in the passenger side and immediately connected her phone to the Bluetooth and put on music he didn't recognize but didn't complain about, and Ethan sat behind the wheel for a moment before he started the engine. He reached into his jacket. He took out the photograph gap-toothed crayon. "My dad," and he looked at it one more time. Then he looked at the girl in the passenger seat, 5 years older than the drawing, infinitely more complicated and more herself, humming along to something he couldn't identify, and scrolling through her phone with the complete self-possession of someone who has decided the crisis is over and it is time to eat. He put the photograph in the glove box. Not because he was done with it, but because the girl in the photo was sitting next to him now, and she didn't need to travel in his pocket anymore. He started the engine. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived from Washington. It was formal, official, full of the language that government documents use when they are trying to say something simple in the most complicated way possible. But underneath all of it, the meaning was clear. His commercial pilot certificate had been reviewed, reinstated, and upgraded. His medical had been fast-tracked and approved. His combat flight hours had been recertified by the FAA in a process that Carla Voss had apparently argued for with the energy of someone who takes losing resources personally. At the bottom of the letter in the signature block was a handwritten note in the margin. 3 words in a hand he recognized from a card she'd slid across a conference table. "You already knew." He read it twice. Then he folded the letter and put it in the same glove box as the photograph, and he drove to the chapter house where his brothers were waiting, and he walked in the leather jacket, and someone handed him a cup of coffee, and he sat down, and he was exactly where he was supposed to be. That weekend, he rode the Harley up the highway along the coast the way he always did when he needed to think, and he stopped at the overlook where the road bends out toward the inlet, and the sky goes on forever. And he cut the engine, and he sat on the bike, and he looked up. A commercial airliner crossed overhead, high and bright, catching the last of the afternoon sun on its wings, drawing a clean white line across the blue. He watched it until it was gone. Then he pulled out his phone and called Marcus Webb. "I'm back in," he said when the man answered. "I know," Marcus Webb said. "I've been waiting for you to figure that out for 5 years. Ethan laughed. "You couldn't have told me." "Wouldn't have done any good," Marcus said. "Man like you has to find it himself. You know that. You've always known that." He did know it. He ended the call and sat for a moment longer on the overlook engine, quiet the wind off the inlet, cold and clean against his face, and he thought about everything a leather jacket could hide and everything it couldn't, and he thought about a little girl who had grown into someone braver than he'd known how to be, and he thought about a promise that he'd broken and kept at the same time, because some promises are bigger than the words you use to make them. He thought about Sat 5A and the silence that had fallen over a cabin when a biker stood up, and the long, full human sound of 200 people cheering in a gate area in Fairbanks for a man they had spent a whole flight being afraid of. He thought about Carla Voss's 3 words. You already knew. He had always known. He had just needed 93 minutes, a failing engine, a dying captain, a first officer who trusted him with everything, an old pilot who saw through a leather jacket straight to the wings underneath, and a 13-year-old girl who told him the truth about himself more clearly than anyone ever had. He had needed all of that just to admit what he already knew. He was a pilot. He had always been a pilot, and a father, and a brother, and a man who, when the world needed him to stand up, stood up. Those things had never been in conflict. He had just been too afraid to let them all be true at the same time. Ethan Walker put his helmet on, started the engine, and pointed the Harley toward home, toward Lily, toward whatever came next, toward the life that had been waiting for him all along on the other side of the fear he'd been calling it a promise. The biker in seat 5A had walked onto a plane as one man and walked off it as another. Not a different man, not a new man, Not the ghost of a captain or the shadow of a soldier or the version of himself he tried to build out of leather and silence. Just the whole man. Finally, all at once, without apology, and that was more than enough. That had always been more than enough.